particularly since 9/11, I think that there's been a racialization of Arab and Muslim Americans and a conflation of those categories. Could you explain to us the distinction between Arab Americans and Muslim Americans and why they're not one and the same groups?
Let me start by just explaining who Arab Americans are and who Muslim Americans are, and then I'll explain why it's become so complicated since 9/11 and why people are so confused over the two categories. So in the simplest terms, Arab is an ethnic group, and it's based on a language, and it traces back to 20 different countries in what we call the Middle East, but it's really Northern Africa and Western Asia. So Arab is an ethnicity. Being a Muslim is a religious categorization. And the problem in the U.S. context is a lot of Muslim and Arabs are assumed to be the same group, whereas in fact, most Arabs in the United States are Christians who immigrated prior to World War I, and most Muslims are actually not Arab. So if you think about it in terms of two circles, an ethnic group and a religious group, there's a little bitty sliver that overlaps, but for the most part, most Muslims are South Asian, about a quarter are African American who've converted to the religion, and most Arabs are actually Christian.
And among Arab Christians, what is the distribution of religious orientations, affiliations, and depth of commitment look like?
The religious diversity among Arab Christians is quite similar to the religious diversity among Christians in the United States. In other words, there's nothing particularly unique about being Arab that makes you more or less religious. So you've got religious Arab Christians and you've also got secular Arab Christians. The thing about the Arab Christians, they're a bit harder to study empirically as a sociologist because they've had a longer history here than have the Arab Muslims, and they've become more integrated in terms of their names. They don't sound Arab any longer, so if you want to do anything to go out and study the community, it's much harder to identify who those people are.
What is the overall percentage of Muslim Americans?
Based on the research I've done over the past 10 years, I would say it's probably anywhere from 3 to 4 million, which is, of roughly just 1% of the American population.
Is the proportion growing?
The proportion of Muslims is growing, but not for the reasons that most people probably think, which is immigration to the U.S. and they're worried about closing the borders, but rather we've seen a really a marked increase in the number of converts to Islam for a variety of reasons, mainly among white Americans and also African Americans. This has been particularly true in prisons.
And what are those reasons that white or African Americans tend to convert?
The reasons that people convert to Islam are varied, and I'm not a theologian, but I will say that one of the things that's attractive for people when they convert to Islam is that it's a very welcoming environment. Sort of the mantra is the ummah, which is the community. So when people convert to anything, they're often looking for some source of identity that makes them feel included. So you often see, that's why I said African Americans in prisons, marginalized groups, converting to something where they feel that they have an identity that gives them a voice where they haven't had one in their prior identities.
Does the veil to Muslim Americans mean something different than it does to Muslims living in other parts of the world? Is there specific meaning in the American context?
The veil is probably the most complicated topic in the Muslim community and outside of it because it's so misunderstood. It has such a symbolic meaning both within the community and it's imbued with often mischaracterized outside of the community. So the veil for Muslim women, I did some research on this several years ago, and it has varied meanings. And it gets back to it's a cultural identity. It's an identity that marks them as different from American women. And one of the interesting things for Muslim American women is that they often do it despite the fact that their families don't want them to. So there's a stereotype that Muslim women are made to veil by their families. But in fact, the research I've done shows that often their families do not want them to do this. They want them to seem more integrated into American culture, and they feel it's going to hinder their success in terms of their jobs, in terms of their family life. But the Muslim American women are very educated, and they feel this is something they want to do for their own individual identity and for their own feelings of being American, because part of being American to them is the freedom to choose to wear this, even if their families don't want them to.